Everyone, this is Revenge Heat. I want to jump straight into this one because I've been sitting on this story for a while and I think it's time. My dad told my entire extended family I had dropped out of college. I hadn't. I was on the dean's list. And when I found out what he'd been saying, I said nothing. I smiled at Thanksgiving dinner and passed the rolls and said nothing. 11 years later, he called me from a hospital waiting room asking me to co-sign a loan. That's where this story ends. But let me tell you where it begins. My name is Tess. I'm 32 now. I work in hospital administration, which is its own kind of irony given how this story closes. People at my job describe me as composed, measured, the kind of person who doesn't raise her voice in meetings even when she has every right to. They don't know it took me the better part of a decade to become that person. They don't know what I used to be, which was a girl who flinched every time her father spoke, who rewrote her sentences mid-thought to make sure nothing she said could be used against her. I grew up in a house where information was currency. My dad collected it, traded it, and spent it when it suited him. He wasn't loud about it, he never screamed. He was the kind of man who smiled when he twisted the knife, who framed cruelty as concern so smoothly you'd feel guilty for bleeding. I was the first person in my family to go to a 4-year university. I had a partial scholarship and took out loans for the rest. My dad made it clear from the beginning that he thought it was a gamble. Not because he didn't believe in education, but because he didn't believe in me specifically. He said I was too sensitive for a competitive program, too easily overwhelmed. He used the word fragile once, at dinner in front of my aunt and uncle, and then laughed when my face changed. Just kidding, Tess. Can't you take a joke? I got in anyway. I moved 4 hours away to a school with a nursing program I'd been researching since I was 16. I called home twice a week for the first semester. By the second semester, I was calling once a week. By the time I hit junior year, I was calling when I had news worth sharing, which was often because things were going well. Really well. I'd switched from nursing into healthcare administration, discovered it fit my brain like nothing else ever had, and made the dean's list 2 semesters in a row. I called my dad to tell him about the first one. He said that's good, and then asked if I was eating enough because I sounded thin. I didn't know that was possible over the phone, but okay. What I didn't know was what he was saying when I wasn't on the line. I found out at a family reunion the summer before my senior year. My cousin pulled me aside near the dessert table, the way people do when they're about to tell you something they think you already know. She said she was really glad I'd figured things out after the hard year. I asked her what she meant. She tilted her head. She said she'd heard I'd had some trouble and had to take a step back from school. I told her I was graduating in 9 months. She stared at me. She said my dad had told her grandfather I'd withdrawn from my program because of stress. I stood there holding a paper plate with a brownie on it and felt something go quiet in me, the way it does right before a storm. She wasn't the only one. I spent the next hour talking to relatives I hadn't seen since the previous Christmas, and I kept hearing versions of the same story, that I'd been struggling, that I'd taken time off, that I was getting back on my feet. My uncle clapped me on the shoulder and said he was glad I hadn't given up. My aunt pulled me in for a hug that lasted a beat too long, the kind people give when they feel sorry for you. Nobody asked me directly. They all spoke around it, the way people do when they've already decided what the truth is and don't want to be corrected. Before I tell you what I did when I walked back over to where my dad was standing with a drink in his hand, I want to ask you something. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you watching from? Because I think about the geography of moments like this. How many people are sitting in their own quiet version of a family gathering, smiling and passing plates while something underneath is already broken? Let me know in the comments. I read all of them. I didn't confront him there. That's the part people always find surprising when I tell this story in person. They expect me to say I walked over and called him out in front of everyone. I didn't. Partly because I was still processing, partly because I knew my dad well enough to know that a public confrontation would just become a story he could use, that he would make himself the victim in a room full of people who already believed his version of me. So I smiled. I went back to the table. I ate my brownie. And I watched him. He was charming that afternoon. He always was in groups. He laughed at the right moments, refilled drinks, told the story about coaching my brother's little league team the summer I was 12. People loved him. He was easy to love if you only saw him in 2-hour increments with other people around. I drove home that night and sat in my apartment parking lot for 40 minutes before going inside. I called my mom's sister, my aunt who lived across the state and who had always been the one adult in my childhood who spoke to me like I had a brain worth engaging. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I'd heard. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd heard something similar from my grandmother 6 months ago. She'd assumed it was a misunderstanding. She hadn't corrected it because she didn't want to cause trouble. That phrase, didn't want to cause trouble, landed somewhere in my chest and sat there. I asked her how long this had been going on. She said she wasn't sure. She said she thought maybe it started around the time I switched programs. She said my dad had mentioned to someone in the family that I'd changed directions because I couldn't handle the coursework. I told her I'd switched because I found something I was better at, something I was actually passionate about, and that my GPA had gone up afterward, not down. She said she believed me. She said she'd always believed me. And then she said something I wrote down afterward on a notepad I kept by my bed. She said the problem with your father isn't that he lies, it's that he curates. He decides what version of you the family gets to see. And he's been doing it so long, nobody thinks to question it. I graduated 8 months later with honors. My aunt came. My brother came. My dad came too, and he took a photo with me afterward that he posted on Facebook with a caption about how proud he was. I almost responded to it. Almost. Instead, I let it sit there collecting likes from people who didn't know the full picture, and I saved the screenshot. The years after graduation were the years I built something. I got my first real job, moved to a city I'd chosen for myself, started paying down my loans. I didn't talk to my dad often. Not because of a dramatic falling out, but because there was nothing neutral left to talk about. Every conversation eventually bent back towards something uncomfortable, some comment about my choices or my timeline, or whether I was seeing someone, delivered in that particular tone of his that made concern sound like criticism. So I kept the calls short and infrequent, and I stopped sharing news I actually cared about. The family narrative about me shifted over those years. I heard versions of it secondhand, through my aunt, through my brother, who was not cruel but was also not strong enough to correct it in real time. Apparently, I had become cold, distant, the kind of person who didn't stay in touch. My dad told his siblings I was busy building a career and that he was proud of me, which sounded generous on the surface, but was always followed by something that undercut it. She doesn't have much time for family anymore. You know how driven people get. I hope she remembers what matters when things slow down. He wasn't wrong that I was driven. He just couldn't say it without attaching a shadow to it. I made director of patient services at 30. It was the kind of title I'd have called my dad about 4 years earlier. Instead, I called my aunt, my 2 closest friends, and my brother. In that order. I went to dinner alone to celebrate, ordered the expensive pasta, and sat there feeling something I hadn't felt in a while, which was unobserved. Nobody at that table had a version of me they were protecting or undermining. I was just a person who had worked hard and earned something real. My dad found out through my brother, who mentioned it casually a month later. He texted me that night, "Heard the good news. Proud of you." I replied, "Thank you." That was the whole conversation. Then came the call. It was a Thursday morning. I was at my desk, going through intake reports, when my phone lit up with his number. He called twice before I picked up. When I answered, I could hear a different quality in his voice immediately. The usual steadiness wasn't there. Something underneath it was frayed. He said he was at the hospital, not as a patient, as a visitor. My uncle, his older brother, had been admitted the night before with a cardiac event. The prognosis was cautiously good, but there was going to be significant recovery. And the hospital visit had surfaced something. My uncle didn't have the coverage he needed. There were gaps in his insurance, unexpected costs, and the family was trying to figure out how to manage them. My dad had been asked to co-sign a personal loan to help cover immediate expenses. But his own credit had some issues he hadn't mentioned to anyone. Old debt from a business venture that had collapsed 3 years ago, and the bank wasn't willing to move forward with just his signature. He needed mine. I sat very still at my desk. My assistant had just walked by and I had smiled at her. I was still holding that expression when I said, "I hear you. What's the timeline?" He said the next few days would be ideal. He said it was a significant amount. He said he wouldn't ask if it weren't an emergency. He said family takes care of family. That last sentence. I wrote it down. I told him I needed to think about it. He said of course. He said he understood. There was a pause and then he said, "I know we've had some distance tests. I want to fix that, chum. I think something like this reminds you what's important." I said, "I agree." I said, "I'll be in touch." And I hung up. I sat in my office for a long time after that. I thought about my cousin at the dessert table. I thought about my aunt's phrase, "He curates." I thought about my uncle, who I genuinely cared about, who had always been kind to me, who had come to my college graduation even though my dad hadn't told him there was a dean's list to celebrate. This wasn't about my uncle. My uncle deserved help, and I hoped he would get it. This was about whether I was willing to walk back into the architecture of obligation my dad built every time he needed something from me. I called my aunt that evening. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which she was very good at. When I finished, she said, "Are you going to do it?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "Whatever you decide it for yourself, and not because you're afraid of what happens if you don't." That was the most useful thing anyone had said to me in years. I called my dad back the next morning. I said I wanted to talk before I made any decisions. He said, "Of course." He sounded relieved. He probably thought I was calling to say yes. I said, "Before we talk about the loan, I need to talk about something else." He asked what. I said, "I know you've been telling people in the family that I struggled in college, that I dropped out or came close, that I had a hard time with my program." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he didn't know what I was talking about. I said I knew he would say that and that was fine, but I wanted him to know I was aware of it. I said I had been aware of it for years. I had been at the reunion where his brother's wife expressed sympathy about my difficult year. I had been in the conversation with my cousin at the dessert table. I had talked to my aunt, who had heard it from my grandmother. He said people misremember things. He said he might have mentioned that I was going through a transition because switching programs was a transition, and he was just trying to explain it. I asked him if he'd mentioned that I made the dean's list during that same transition. He didn't answer. I said, "I'm not calling to fight. I want to be really clear about that. I'm calling because I've spent a long time staying quiet about the version of me you've shared with this family, and I think that silence has cost me relationships I might have otherwise had. I'm not asking you to fix that today, but I need you to understand that I know." He said, "Tess, I've only ever wanted good things for you." I said, "I know you believe that." He said, "I don't understand why you'd bring this up now of all times." I said, "Because you asked me for something, and before I answer, I needed to say the true thing. That's all." He was quiet again, and then his voice shifted. Not to the charming version and not to the defensive version, but to something I hadn't heard in a long time. Something closer to uncertain. He said, "I was scared when you changed programs. I didn't know how to explain it to people." I said, "So you explained it by making it my failure." He said, "I didn't mean it that way." I said, "I know. I think that might be the part that took me the longest to understand. That you didn't mean it, and it still happened, and that both things are true at the same time." I told him I was not going to co-sign the loan. He didn't say anything immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. He asked why. I said because co-signing a loan means absorbing financial risk, and I wasn't in a position to do that with someone I didn't have a clear and honest relationship with. I told him that wasn't a punishment, it was just an honest accounting of where we were. I told him I hoped my uncle got what he needed and that I was willing to contribute what I could directly to my uncle's care out of my own pocket as a gift, no strings and no co-signing. But I was not going to tie my credit and my financial future to an agreement with him right now. He said he was disappointed. I said I understood. He said he hoped I wouldn't regret this. I noticed how the sentence was constructed, not "I hope things work out." "I hope you won't regret this." The shadow again, right on schedule. I said, "I think I'll be okay," and I meant it. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a conversation like that. Not comfortable, not hostile, more like the silence after a door closes and the sound finally settles. I sat with it for a while. I thought about whether I had done the right thing, not whether I had done the righteous thing, but the right thing. The honest and considered and livable thing. I thought about my uncle and made good on what I'd said. I transferred money directly to his wife that afternoon with a note that said it was for whatever helped. She texted back a long message that ended with the sentence, "You have always been the steady one." I didn't know she thought that. I didn't know anyone in the family thought that. Weeks passed. My dad did not call. My brother called once to check in, carefully, the way he always navigated things between us. He didn't take sides out loud. He rarely did. But near the end of the call, he said, "Whatever happened with Dad, I hope you know I'm on your side." I said, "I know." And that was enough. My aunt told me later that my dad had found other arrangements for the cosign, a colleague apparently willing to help. She said he had not spoken well of me to her when she'd seen him at a family birthday. She said he had described me as having become hard, unfeeling. She said she had told him calmly that in her experience I was one of the most feeling people she knew, and that perhaps what he was seeing was not hardness, but limits. She said he hadn't responded to that. He had just refilled his drink and changed the subject. I want to say that I felt victorious in that moment when she told me. I didn't really. What I felt was tired in the way you feel after a long effort. Not miserable tired, but done tired. Like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't yours to carry. My dad and I are not close now. We are not estranged in the dramatic sense people imagine when they hear that phrase. We exchange birthday texts. We see each other at Thanksgiving. He tells me I look well. I tell him the same. He does not ask about my work in the specific way he used to, the probing way that looked like curiosity but was really surveillance. Maybe because he knows I won't give him information to work with. Maybe because something in that phone call shifted the architecture enough that he can't quite find the door he used to use. I'm not sure I'll ever get an apology. Not the real kind. The kind that doesn't have a but buried in the middle. And I've had to make peace with the possibility that my dad is not capable of that. Not because he's evil, but because admitting it would require him to hold two ideas at once. That he loves me, and that love alone is not enough to excuse harm. What I do have is something I wouldn't trade. I have a version of my family relationships that is mine. My uncle calls me sometimes, just to talk. My aunt and I have dinner when we're in the same city. My brother texts me memes that are only funny if you grew up in our house, which I did, so they land exactly right. These are relationships I rebuilt from the parts that were real. Quiet, unhurried, built on what was actually there rather than on the story my dad told about it. And I have my work, which is real, and mine and was never anybody else's to narrate. Someone asked me recently if I was angry. They meant it sincerely. I thought about it for a moment. I said I had been angry, genuinely and deeply, for years longer than was useful. But anger, for me, had always been a sign that something needed to change. Once I changed it, the anger didn't have a purpose anymore, so it left, mostly. Some days it comes back for a visit. I let it sit, I have a cup of tea, and eventually it remembers it doesn't live here anymore. If you are listening to this and you recognize something in it, I want to say this directly. Being told a false version of yourself by people who are supposed to know you best is a particular kind of damage. It's hard to name because it doesn't always look like what we're told abuse looks like. There's no shouting. There are no marks. There is just a slow accumulation of the wrong story, told in rooms you weren't in, by someone who needed you, smaller than you were. You are allowed to know the difference between the version of you that was told and the version that is true. You are allowed to name it. You are allowed to decide that co-signing someone's story of you is not the same as family loyalty, and you are allowed to close a door gently and still mean it completely. So tell me honestly, if someone you loved had spent years quietly revising who you were to the people around you, and then called asking for something significant, what would you do? Would you have answered differently? Would you have said yes? Comment below. I'm genuinely curious, because the more we talk about the quiet ways control works inside families, the harder it becomes to pretend it isn't there. Thank you for listening. Really. This one took a while to say out loud. A note on the father in this story. He is not a cartoon villain. That's what makes him difficult to explain to people outside the situation. He is a man who experienced his daughter's independence as a threat, who processed that threat by making her look diminished in the eyes of people whose opinions he could influence. He called it concern. He called it realism. He never called it what it was. The lesson, if there is one, is that people who love you can still cause harm, and that recognizing harm is not the same as stop loving them. It's just seeing clearly. And seeing clearly is where every good decision starts. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in this story. Not the phone call, not the cosign conversation, not even the reunion with the brownie and the too long hug from my aunt. I mean what actually happened underneath all of it. Over all those years, my father made choices, small ones, mostly. A sentence here, a gentle reframe there. He chose to tell his brother, I was struggling when I was thriving. He chose to explain my program switch as failure when it was, by every measurable standard, the opposite. He chose again and again to hand the family a version of me that made him feel less threatened by who I was becoming. And he made those choices so consistently, over so long a stretch of time, that they accumulated into something with real weight. Relationships I didn't have, relatives who pitied me instead of celebrating me. A graduation photo on Facebook that collected likes from people who had no idea there was a dean's list behind it. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about family dysfunction. They talk about the blow-ups, the dramatic moments, the things that make for a clean story. They don't talk about the slow erosion, the way a reputation gets carved away, not with one event, but with 100 quiet editorial decisions made in rooms you weren't in. My father didn't do one terrible thing. He did one small thing, many times, for many years, and the accumulation was its own kind of harm. What I had to learn, and it took longer than I'd like to admit, was that I was not responsible for correcting a story I hadn't told. For years I tried to manage it from the inside, dropping hints, achieving things loudly enough that maybe the facts would speak for themselves. They didn't. Facts don't correct narratives on their own. People have to decide to hold them, and the people in my family had been given an easier story to hold, so they held it. The decision not to co-sign the loan was not revenge. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect this kind of story to end with satisfaction, with some clean moment of justice that balances the ledger. It didn't feel like that. It felt like simple honesty. I could not in good conscience enter a financial agreement with someone I did not have an honest relationship with. That wasn't cruelty. That was just cause and effect. He had spent years making the ground between us unstable. When he needed to stand on it, it didn't hold. That's the thing about the way we treat people. Not morality in any grand sense, just the plain mechanics of it. How we show up for someone in the ordinary years determines what we have access to in the hard ones. My father wanted the benefits of a close relationship with a daughter he'd spent years quietly diminishing. Those two things can't coexist. Not because of punishment, but because trust is built or it isn't, and you cannot spend it if you never deposited it. What I'm proudest of is not the phone call. It's the decade before it, the years I kept building anyway, kept achieving anyway, kept being myself anyway, even when I knew the family's version of me didn't match. That required something I didn't have a word for when I was doing it. I'd call it now a kind of quiet insistence on your own reality, knowing what is true about yourself and refusing to let someone else's narration replace it, even when they're louder, even when they have more of the room. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from this, it's that. You don't have to argue with the false version of you. You don't have to win that fight publicly. You just have to keep being the real one, steadily, in the direction of the life you're actually building. The truth doesn't always arrive fast, but it tends to arrive.